Tom Ricketts' hands trembled as he watched the Apache warrior dig with bleeding fingers at the shallow grave. Every scrape of earth revealed more of what he'd tried to bury. First the crown of dark hair, then a tiny face streaked with dirt and mucus. Finally, small shoulders that shuddered with each desperate breath. 3 months he'd known the truth. 3 months since he'd walked into the church storage room to find his wife, Mary Ellen, pressed against the wall. Reverend Gaines's hands tangled in her hair, both of them gasping like drowning people when they saw him standing in the doorway. The baby wasn't his, had never been his. And now this Apache stranger was undoing what the drought and eclipse and community fear had demanded: the burial of a bastard child born under cursed omens. "Papa, why?" Clara's voice cut through his thoughts like a blade. His 6-year-old daughter knelt beside the shallow pit, her calico dress torn from the thorns that had caught her during their march into the desert. Tears carved tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "Why did you put her in the ground? She's just a baby, Papa. She didn't hurt nobody." Tom's jaw worked silently. How do you explain adult betrayal to a child? How do you tell your daughter that her mother's infidelity had created this problem, that the town's superstitions had provided the solution? That burying her half-sister alive had seemed like the only way to salvage what remained of his dignity and their family's standing. Nahiosi lifted the newborn from her intended grave, cradling her against his weathered buckskin vest. The infant's cries were weak but persistent, the sound of someone fighting to stay anchored to life, despite everything trying to pull her away. The Apache warrior's hands shook not from the digging, but from memory, from his grandfather's whispered stories about the old days when winter hunger drove some Apache to abandon weak children to the desert's judgment. Those stories had haunted the old man until death, and they had shaped Nahiosi's promise to never let such things happen again, not while he drew breath. "Apache, step away from that grave." Sheriff Morrison's voice carried the weight of reluctant authority from where he sat his horse 30 yards back. At 48, Morrison had spent 15 years trying to balance territorial law with frontier necessity. But today's task sat in his gut, like spoiled meat. Behind him, 6 other men from Dustwater watched from their saddles, their faces set with the grim certainty of people convinced they were doing God's work. "This child has done nothing to deserve death." Nahiosi replied, his English heavily accented but clear. He brushed dirt from the baby's nostrils with gentle fingers. "Your drought comes from sky, not from small girl. The drought comes from God's displeasure." Reverend Gaines spoke from his position at Morrison's right hand. At 35, he was a lean man with pale eyes and hands soft from avoiding honest labor. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, though today it held an undercurrent of barely controlled anxiety. "And the Lord said unto Abraham, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and offer him for a burnt offering." Sometimes sacrifice is required for the greater good. Clara scrambled to her feet, her small fists clenched with 6-year-old fury. "She's not a burnt offering. She's my sister, and you're mean to want to hurt her." The words hung in the desert air like gun smoke. Several of the mounted men shifted uncomfortably. It was one thing to rationalize infanticide as divine necessity when discussing it in the church basement, quite another to explain it to a child whose only crime was loving her baby sister. "Clara, come away from there." Tom called his voice rougher than intended. The sight of his daughter's tears was doing things to his resolve that he couldn't afford. Not when the whole town was watching. Not when his reputation and their survival depended on seeing this through. "Come to Papa now." But Clara pressed closer to Nahiosi's side, her small hand reaching up to touch the baby's cheek. "She's warm," she whispered with wonder. "Look, Papa, she's looking right at me. She knows I'm her big sister." Indeed, the infant's dark eyes had opened and seemed to focus on Clara's face with unusual alertness for one so young. Her cries had quieted to soft mewling sounds, that spoke more of recognition than distress. Tom felt something twist in his chest. Guilt, perhaps, or the remnant of protective instincts that months of anger hadn't entirely killed. But then he remembered walking into that storage room, remembered Mary Ellen's gasp of horror when she saw him, remembered Gaines fumbling with his collar while muttering about comforting the afflicted. The humiliation burned fresh and hot, driving away any softness. The signs are unmistakable. Gaines continued his sermon voice, taking on the rhythm that made people listen whether they wanted to or not. Eclipse birth during 7 months of drought. Born of adultery into a community that suffers. Even the earth itself rejected her. See how the ground fought our shovels. She must return to the dust so God's wrath may be appeased. Nahiosi studied the preacher's face, noting how his gaze avoided the baby entirely, how his left hand kept moving to something concealed beneath his black coat. Fear the Apache warrior recognized. Not righteous conviction, but the desperate terror of a man whose secrets were about to destroy him. My grandfather told stories. Nahiosi said slowly, his voice carrying across the desert stillness with surprising authority. About Apache who did such things in hungry times, left weak children for spirits to claim. He said those children's cries followed our people for generations, wailing in every storm wind. He made us promise, never again. Never let fear make us monsters. The heathen superstition. Gaines snapped, but his voice cracked slightly on the words. Maybe so, Nahiosi acknowledged. But I haven't heard crying children in Apache winds for many seasons. How long since you heard them in yours, preacher man? The question struck home with devastating accuracy. Even the horses seemed to sense the sudden tension, shifting restlessly and snorting soft warnings through their nostrils. Morrison's mount took 2 sideways steps, forcing the sheriff to tighten his grip on the reins. Enough talk, Morrison said, though his voice lacked conviction. Apache, I'm asking you one last time to step aside. We don't want violence, but we'll use it if necessary. Morrison's hand rested on his Colt revolver without drawing it. The other men were similarly armed, but not actively threatening yet. There was still a chance this could end without bloodshed if the Apache would just accept the inevitable and ride away. But Nahiosi remembered his grandfather's final words, whispered from a deathbed, heavy with shame. Promise me, boy. Promise you'll never let the strong prey on the helpless when you have power to stop it. Some promises were worth dying for. I have seen enough death of innocence. Nahiosi said quietly, then stepped backward toward a cluster of prickly pear cacti, Clara moving with him like a faithful shadow. I will not see more today. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Tom felt his throat closing as he watched his daughter choose sides against her own father. Whatever happened next would mark them all forever, either as people who'd found courage to do right or as cowards who'd murdered a baby to appease their fears. Jake Henley broke the moment. At 23, he was the youngest of the men and the most eager to prove his resolve. Hell with this talking, he snarled, spurring his horse forward while drawing his pistol. Apache wants to die protecting a bastard, let's oblige him. The gunshot cracked across the desert like lightning, sending horses rearing, and Clara screaming in terror. But Jake's shot went wide as his mount shied from a sudden gust of wind, the bullet spanging harmlessly off rocks 20 feet from Nahiosi's position. Jake, you damned fool! Morrison shouted, fighting to control his spooked horse. Hold your fire. But it was too late. The line between negotiation and violence had been crossed, and there was no pulling it back. More shots followed as other men drew their weapons, filling the air with smoke and the angry whine of ricochets off stone. Nahiosi dove behind the cacti with Clara pressed against his side, and the baby clutched protectively to his chest. The infant was crying again now, her wails cutting through the gunfire like an accusation against every man present. Stop it. Clara's voice rose above the chaos, shrill with terror and fury. Stop shooting, you're scaring her. From his position behind the spiny desert plants, Nahiosi could see what the mounted men couldn't: dark clouds building on the horizon, moving fast across the endless sky, with the promise of one of the violent storms that could turn desert arroyos into death traps within minutes. "Storm comes," he called out to the gunman. "Big storm. We should seek shelter before—" Pete Henley's rifle cracked, cutting off his words. The bullet burned a furrow across Nahiosi's left shoulder, spinning him halfway around and sending blood streaming down his arm. Clara screamed again, pressing herself flat against the ground as chips of cactus flew around them like green shrapnel. "Got him!" Pete shouted triumphantly. Apache's bleeding, but Nahiosi was far from finished. Blood loss would slow him eventually, but for now, adrenaline and determination kept him moving. He understood Apache warfare better than these farmers and shopkeepers. Sometimes the best defense was an unexpected attack, when everyone thought you were trapped and helpless. "Clara," he whispered urgently, while pressing cloth torn from his shirt against his wounded shoulder. "When I move, count to 20, then run to those tall rocks behind us. Do not look back until you are safe." "What about you?" Clara's eyes were wide with fear, but there was steel beneath the terror, the same strength that had made her throw herself over the baby when the shooting started. "I will come," Apache promised. Before Clara could protest, Nahiosi burst from the cacti at an angle none of the men expected. Instead of fleeing directly away from them, he sprinted along their flank toward a rocky outcrop that would provide better cover, zigzagging to spoil their aim, while the baby bounced against his chest. The sudden movement caught them completely off guard. Jake's second shot went wide as his horse reared. Morrison's weapon wasn't even drawn yet, and Pete was still working the lever on his rifle when Nahiosi reached the rocks and dove for cover. "Clara now," he shouted. The 6-year-old girl ran with the desperate speed of someone whose world had exploded around her. Her torn dress whipped behind her as she crossed the open ground between cover points, the sound of her sobbing almost as heartbreaking as her sister's cries. More gunshots followed, but the approaching storm was already affecting visibility and aim. Dust devils spun between the men and their targets, and the first sharp gusts of wind were making the horses increasingly difficult to control. "Spread out," Morrison commanded, though his voice held more uncertainty than authority. "Don't let them reach high ground." But even as he gave the order, Morrison was beginning to understand what they were really doing. Not enforcing community justice or divine will, but hunting a wounded man and 2 children across desert terrain, because their preacher wanted to hide his adultery behind infanticide. The realization hit him like a physical blow, making him rein in his horse instead of spurring it forward. When had he become the kind of lawman who chased down wounded Apache warriors to force them to surrender babies for execution? Meanwhile, Gaines was having his own crisis of resolve. Seeing the Apache and the children escaping toward the rocks, he made a decision that revealed just how far he was willing to go to protect his secrets. The second pistol appeared from beneath his coat with practiced ease. Not the single-shot weapon of a frontier preacher, but a double-action revolver that spoke of careful preparation for exactly this moment. Morrison saw the gun and understood with shocking clarity that Gaines had been planning violence all along, had manipulated them all into this position. Not through desperate improvisation, but through calculated malice. "Gaines," Morrison shouted. "What the hell?" But the preacher was already firing, not at the fleeing Apache, but at Tom Ricketts. The shot took Tom in the shoulder and spun him from his saddle, sending him rolling across the hard-packed earth while his horse bolted in panic. "You son of a bitch." Tom gasped from the ground, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "Your own baby, and you'd kill me to cover it up. How come my reputation is worth more than any bastard child?" Gaines snarled, his mask of religious authority finally slipping away entirely. "More than any of you, if you threaten what I've built." The admission sent shockwaves through the remaining men. This wasn't about divine displeasure or community protection. This was about a desperate man, willing to commit multiple murders to hide his adultery. Sheriff Morrison drew his weapon and pointed it at the preacher he trusted to guide their moral decisions. "Drop that gun, Gaines. Drop it now." "I don't think so, Sheriff. Trying, Mo." Gaines replied with a cold smile. "You see, you're all complicit now. You all came out here to bury that baby alive. When this is over, you'll keep quiet about what really happened, or you'll all hang alongside me." The logic was twisted, but undeniable. They'd all participated in attempted infanticide, all followed Gaines's lead in justifying murder through superstition. Even if they stopped him now, their own guilt would silence them forever. But Gaines had made one critical error. He'd assumed that Mary Ellen Ricketts would stay home as ordered, that she wouldn't follow her husband and daughters into the desert to discover what was being done in the name of divine justice. Her voice cut across the confrontation like a blade. Thomas, where are you?" Everyone turned to see Mary Ellen approaching on foot, having left her horse behind when it refused to advance into the worsening weather. At 26, she was still beautiful despite the hardships of frontier life. But today, her face was haggard with exhaustion and mounting terror. "Mary Ellen, go back," Tom called from where he lay bleeding. "It's not safe here." But Mary Ellen had already seen too much: the guns, the blood, the scattered evidence of violence, in a place where her daughters were supposed to have been taken for burial. Her face went white with understanding. "Oh, where are my children?" she demanded, her voice carrying a mother's fury that made even armed men take notice. "Where are Clara and the baby?" "Safe," came Nahiosi's voice from the rocks above them. "For now. But storm comes fast. We must all seek shelter soon, or desert will bury us all." Indeed, the approaching tempest was becoming impossible to ignore. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. The wind was picking up steadily, carrying the scent of rain and the electricity that preceded the kind of flash floods that could kill everyone in the area regardless of their conflicts. But Gaines was beyond rational thought now. Seeing his carefully constructed world collapsing around him, he made one final desperate decision. If he couldn't maintain his authority through manipulation and murder, perhaps he could reclaim it through force and terror. "Mary Ellen," he called out with false gentleness, "come here, my dear. We need to discuss your children's situation." But Mary Ellen had spent months living with the guilt and fear of their affair, months watching Gaines grow more controlling and desperate as her pregnancy advanced. She knew exactly what kind of man he really was. "You told me the eclipse birth was God's judgment," she said, her voice shaking with betrayal and rage. "You said the town demanded burial to end the drought. But that was all lies, wasn't it? You just wanted to eliminate the evidence of what we'd done." "What we'd done?" Gaines laughed bitterly. "You seduced me, woman. You came to me for comfort and threw yourself at a man of God. I was merely weak enough to succumb to temptation." The rewriting of history was so blatant, so calculated, that even the watching men felt sick. Tom struggled to sit up despite his wounded shoulder, his face twisted with pain and fury. "Tell them the truth, Gaines," Tom snarled. "Tell them how you threatened Mary Ellen. Tell them about the herbs you tried to get her to take, the ones that would have killed the baby before birth." Mary Ellen's gasp was audible even over the rising wind. "You told me those were just to ease morning sickness. You said they were safe, that many women used them. And you were fool enough to believe me," Gaines sneered. "Just like you were fool enough to think I actually cared about you. Do you know how many lonely wives have found comfort in my counsel over the years? Did you really think you were special?" The cruelty of the revelation staggered Mary Ellen, but it also freed her from any lingering guilt or loyalty. Whatever mistakes she'd made, they paled beside the calculated malice of the man she'd trusted with her deepest fears and needs. "You monster," she whispered, then louder. "You absolute monster. How many other women, how many other children born that you wanted dead?" But Gaines was no longer interested in confession or conversation. The storm was almost upon them, providing the perfect cover for eliminating all the witnesses to his crimes. He raised his revolver toward Mary Ellen with cold deliberation. "Enough talking," he said. "Time to clean up my mistakes." The shot that followed didn't come from Gaines's weapon. Sheriff Morrison, finally understanding the full scope of the preacher's evil, had acted with the swift decisiveness that 15 years of frontier law enforcement had taught him. His bullet took Gaines in the gun arm, spinning the preacher around and sending his weapon flying into the desert scrub. But Morrison's shot was also the signal for the storm to unleash its full fury upon them. What had been building tension in the sky suddenly became a deluge of rain driven horizontal by winds that threatened to knock men and horses off their feet. Lightning turned the landscape stark white with every flash, followed by thunder that drowned out all other sounds. In the chaos, everyone scattered for whatever shelter they could find. Tom tried to reach Mary Ellen, but collapsed from blood loss halfway there. Morrison fought to control his panicking horse while keeping his weapon trained on the wounded Gaines. The other men struggled with their own mounts or dove for cover behind rocks and cacti. And high above them all, Nahiyasi understood with growing horror that the real danger was just beginning. The terrain they were in, a network of dry creek beds and stone channels, was perfect for concentrating storm runoff into devastating flash floods. In minutes, everyone in the area could be swept away, regardless of their conflicts or allegiances. "Clara," he called over the storm noise. "We must move to higher ground. Flash flood comes." But Clara was crying too hard to hear him clearly, her small body shaking with terror as wind and rain lashed at their rocky shelter. The baby in her arms was screaming now, sensing the chaos and danger even if she couldn't understand it. Nahiyasi made the hardest decision of his life. Scooping up both children despite his wounded shoulder, he began climbing toward the highest ground available, a knife-edge ridge that would keep them above any flood, but would also expose them completely to anyone who wanted to shoot them. Behind him, the adults were making their own desperate choices as the desert erupted in violence, both human and natural. And ahead lay only the slim hope that mercy and courage might somehow prevail over fear and hatred in the face of nature's ultimate indifference to human failings. The storm was just beginning, and before it was over, everyone's true character would be revealed in ways that no one could predict or control. The arroyo floor had been bone dry when they'd entered it, but now water was ankle deep and rising fast as runoff from the mountains channeled through the narrow canyon. Nahiyasi carried both children while blood seeped through the makeshift bandage on his shoulder, each step a calculated risk between speed and stability on the slippery stone. Clara clung to his neck while trying to keep a protective grip on her baby sister. "Where are we going?" she called over the roar of approaching water. "More high ground." Nahiyasi replied, though he could already hear what was coming, a deep, continuous rumble that spoke of massive volumes of water moving with terrifying speed through channels carved by thousands of years of similar storms. Big flood comes. Very dangerous. Indeed, the flash flood appeared around the arroyo's bend, like a brown wall of destruction, carrying tree trunks, boulders, and debris from settlements miles upstream. It moved faster than a galloping horse and carried enough force to pulverize anything in its path. There, Nahiyasi spotted their only chance, a massive boulder that had tumbled into the creek bed years ago, creating a small island that might rise above the flood's peak. "We climb up and hold tight." They reached the boulder just as the first surge hit. The impact sent spray 20 feet into the air and soaked them instantly. But the ancient stone held firm against forces that had shaped this landscape for millennia. Nahiyasi boosted Clara onto the rock's curved surface, then handed her the baby before scrambling up himself with his wounded arm, screaming in protest. "Hold her tight," he told Clara as water swirled around the base of their refuge. "Do not let go no matter what happens." Clara pressed her baby sister against her chest with fierce determination. Whatever else she didn't understand about this day, she understood one thing clearly: she would not let her sister die. The water level rose with terrifying speed, reaching within inches of their rocky island's peak within minutes. Debris slammed into their refuge with tremendous force. Dead animals, broken furniture, even parts of buildings swept away from upstream communities. Each impact threatened to dislodge them or crack the boulder that was their only protection. Then the human voices began screams of terror and desperation that meant some of their pursuers had been caught by the same waters that now threatened them all. The first figure to appear in the torrent was Jake Henley, his arms windmilling frantically as he tried to stay afloat while being tumbled like debris in the muddy current. His rifle was gone, his hat was gone, and his face held the blank panic of someone who suddenly understood that all their human conflicts meant nothing compared to nature's indifferent power. He swept past their boulder too quickly and too far away to reach safely. His final scream was cut short as the current pulled him under, weighed down by waterlogged clothes and boots that had been practical for riding, but were death sentences in floodwater. "Jesus," Clara whispered, pressing her face against Nahiosi's chest to avoid seeing more. But more was coming. Pete Henley appeared next, clinging to a broken tree branch that was barely keeping his head above water. The current was carrying him directly toward their boulder, close enough to reach if Nahiosi was willing to risk all their lives in the attempt. "Help." Pete's voice was barely audible over the flood's roar, but his eyes locked with Nahiosi's as the current swept him closer. "Please, I got kids at home." It was a moment that defined character more clearly than any sermon or moral lecture ever could. Pete had been shooting at them less than an hour ago, trying to kill an Apache warrior and force the execution of an innocent baby. Justice would be letting him drown. Mercy would be trying to save him despite the risk. Clara made the decision for all of them. "We have to help him," she said with the moral clarity that sometimes comes with childhood innocence. "We can't just watch him die." As Pete swept within reach, Nahiosi grabbed the man's shirt and hauled him partially onto their rocky refuge. Pete was unconscious from cold and exhaustion, blood streaming from where debris had struck his head. But he was alive. The boulder was crowded now, barely large enough for 3 people, and the water was still rising. When Sheriff Morrison appeared in the current a few minutes later, there seemed to be no room left. But Morrison wasn't helplessly swept along like the others. The sheriff was fighting the current with methodical strokes, using his knowledge of the terrain to angle toward their position with grim determination. When he reached the boulder, Nahiosi helped pull him up without hesitation. "Tom." Morrison gasped, coughing up muddy water. "Mary Ellen, what happened to—" His question was answered when Tom Ricketts appeared on the arroyo rim above them, supporting his wife with his good arm, while his wounded shoulder bled freely through his shirt. They'd managed to reach high ground before the flood hit, but now they were trapped on opposite sides of a raging torrent from their daughters. Clara, Mary Ellen's voice cracked with desperate relief at seeing her children alive. "Oh God, Clara, are you hurt?" "We're okay, Mama," Clara called back, though her voice shook with exhaustion and fear. "The Apache man saved us." Tom looked down at the man who'd prevented the murder of his wife's bastard child, the enemy who'd become their salvation. "Nahiosi!" He called over the water's roar. "Can you get them to safety?" "The water goes down soon," Nahiosi replied. "But more danger comes. Preacher man still has gun." Indeed, Reverend Gaines had also reached the rim, though, on the opposite side from Tom and Mary Ellen. Morrison's bullet had shattered his gun arm, but he'd managed to retrieve his fallen weapon with his left hand. Blood loss and pain had stripped away the last of his sanity, leaving only desperate malice. "This ends now," Gaines called across the flood, his voice barely human with pain and rage. "All of you die here, and the secret dies with you." The shots that followed were wild and poorly aimed due to his injuries, but deadly enough at close range. Bullets sparked off the boulder's surface and whined away into the storm, each one threatening to kill someone who'd already survived more than they'd ever expected to. "He's lost his mind," Morrison muttered, drawing his own weapon but unable to get a clear shot across the churning water. That's when Mary Ellen made the choice that would haunt her forever. Seeing her children trapped on a rock in the middle of a flood, while a madman tried to kill them, she broke away from Tom's supporting arm and began working her way down the treacherous slope toward the water. "Mary Ellen, no." Tom shouted, but she was already gone, slipping and sliding down wet stone with the desperate determination of a mother whose babies were in mortal danger. She hit the floodwater with a splash and immediately disappeared beneath the surface. For terrifying seconds, there was no sign of her, and Tom screamed her name with voice-breaking desperation. Then she surfaced 20 yards downstream, swimming with clumsy but determined strokes toward the boulder where her daughters waited. The current was carrying her away from them, but she fought it with maternal fury that gave her strength beyond her physical limits. Gaines saw her in the water and shifted his aim toward the struggling figure. His left-handed shooting was erratic, but at this range, even wild shots might find their target. "Mama!" Clara screamed as bullets splashed into the water around Mary Ellen's thrashing form. That's when Tom Ricketts made his own defining choice. Despite his wounded shoulder, despite the blood loss that made him dizzy and weak, he launched himself down the slope after his wife. Not because he'd forgiven her betrayal or forgotten his humiliation, but because she was the mother of his child. No child should have to watch her mother die. His leap carried him into the flood just as Gaines fired again. The bullet meant for Mary Ellen took Tom in the side instead, but his momentum carried him into collision with his wife, just as the current was about to sweep her away from the boulder entirely. "Tom," Mary Ellen gasped as he grabbed her arm with his good hand. "Your shoulder—" "Shut up and swim," Tom replied through gritted teeth, using his body to shield her from further shots, while they both fought toward their daughters. They reached the boulder just as the flood crested. Nahiosi and Morrison grabbed them both, hauling the wounded couple onto their increasingly crowded refuge as water lapped at the very edges of their salvation. "Is he dead?" Clara asked, looking at her father's blood-soaked shirt with wide, terrified eyes. "Not yet," Tom managed with a weak smile. "Takes more than a crazy preacher to kill your old papa." But their reunion was cut short by continued gunfire from the rim. Gaines was beyond rational thought, now firing methodically at the boulder with left-handed determination that was becoming more accurate as he adjusted for the unfamiliar grip. "Oh, we're sitting ducks here," Morrison muttered, trying to return fire across the churning water. "Soon as the flood goes down enough, he'll come across and finish us all at close range." That's when the debris-laden current provided an unexpected solution. A massive cottonwood tree, torn from its roots somewhere upstream, came tumbling through the flood with its branches spread like grasping fingers. One of those branches caught Reverend Gaines as he leaned over the rim for a better shot, sweeping him into the torrent before he could react. His scream was lost in the water's roar, but they could all see him being carried downstream, his black coat billowing around him as he was tumbled end over end in the merciless current. "Should we try to save him?" Clara asked, her voice small with uncertainty. The adults looked at each other across the crowded boulder. Gaines had orchestrated attempted infanticide, threatened them all with guns, and tried to commit multiple murders to hide his crimes. Justice would be letting the flood claim him, but mercy was a choice that defined the chooser more than the recipient. There me." Morrison pointed to where Gaines had managed to grab a broken fence post and was using it to stay partially afloat about 50 yards downstream. "Currents carrying him toward that sandbar. If we can get a rope to him." Tom looked at the preacher who'd seduced his wife and tried to murder his children. Then at Clara's earnest face as she watched the drowning man struggle for his life. "Pete's belt," Tom said weakly. "Morrison's too. Tie them together with cloth strips from our shirts. make a line long enough to reach. It took precious minutes to fashion their improvised rope, while Gaines fought to stay afloat in the diminishing current. By the time they'd created something long enough to span the distance, the preacher was barely conscious and clinging to debris by instinct alone. Morrison made the throw his frontier-honed skills, sending the makeshift line within Gaines's reach. For a moment, it seemed the preacher was too far gone to recognize salvation, but desperation gave him strength to grab the rope and hold on. They pulled him to the boulder, slowly, carefully fighting the current's attempts to tear him away. When they finally hauled his waterlogged form onto the rock, Gaines was unconscious and barely breathing, but alive. "Why?" Morrison asked as he worked to clear water from the preacher's lungs. After everything he did, why save him? Clara answered with the wisdom that sometimes emerges from innocence confronted with adult evil. "Because if we let him die, we become like him, mean and scary and full of hate." The flood was receding now, to the peak having passed, and water levels dropping rapidly as the storm moved on toward distant mountains. Within an hour, they'd be able to wade to safety and begin the long process of figuring out what came next. But first, there would be reckonings. Truths told and lies exposed. Choices made about justice and mercy, about forgiveness and accountability. About what kind of people they wanted to be after surviving something that had revealed both the worst and best of human nature. As the sun broke through dissipating clouds and cast long shadows across the debris-strewn landscape, the survivors huddled together on their rocky island and began the difficult work of being human beings who'd learned what they were capable of when pushed to their limits. Some of what they'd learned was terrible, but some of it the courage of a 6-year-old girl, the sacrifice of a wounded father, the mercy of an Apache warrior, gave them hope that people could choose to be better than their circumstances demanded. And in the end, that hope might be enough to build something worth preserving from the wreckage of their old lives. The abandoned line shack squatted in a fold of red sandstone hills like a weathered bone left by some long-dead giant. Built by a cattle rancher who'd given up on the high country when Apache raids made ranching too dangerous, it provided 4 walls and a roof that didn't leak too badly luxury accommodations for people who'd spent the day fighting for their lives against both human evil and natural disaster. Getting everyone there had taken the better part of the evening. Gaines remained unconscious and had to be carried by Morrison and Pete Henley, who'd recovered enough from his own near drowning to help with the burden. Tom needed Mary Ellen's support to walk, despite his protests about his wounded side being just a scratch. Clara had insisted on carrying her baby sister the entire distance, refusing all offers of help with the stubborn determination of someone who'd learned that the only person she could truly count on to protect her sister was herself. Now, as full darkness settled over the high desert and Nahiosi coaxed a fire to life in the shack's stone fireplace, the survivors sat in a rough circle that would have seemed impossible just 12 hours earlier. Apache warrior and white settlers, adulterer and betrayed husband, corrupt preacher, and honest sheriff, all united by shared trauma and the recognition that they'd barely escaped something that would have destroyed them all. The baby was feeding from another improvised bottle, this one fashioned from a piece of oiled cloth and leather cord from Nahiosi's belt. She seemed content enough with the arrangement, though Mary Ellen's milk had dried up from shock and hypothermia, making proper nursing impossible. "She's so quiet," Mary Ellen whispered, stroking her daughter's dark hair with fingers that still trembled from cold and exhaustion. After everything that happened today, she should be screaming. Babies know when they are safe. Nahiosi said from his position by the fire. His wounded shoulder was bound with strips torn from Pete's shirt. And though he moved carefully, the Apache warrior showed no sign of the pain that must be coursing through his body. She trusts the people holding her. That is enough. Tom sat across the fire from his wife, his face unreadable in the flickering light. The bullet wound in his side had stopped bleeding, but the injury was deep enough to make every breath painful. More painful, perhaps, was the conversation they all knew was coming, the reckoning with truths that could no longer be avoided or denied. "We need to talk about what happens next," Sheriff Morrison said quietly. He'd been cleaning his revolver, a nervous habit that helped him think through complex problems. "When we don't return to Dustwater, people will come looking. Search parties, questions, investigations. Let them look." Pete Henley muttered from where he sat, nursing a cup of coffee brewed from grounds found in the shack's supplies. His near-death experience in the flood had left him shaken and introspective. "Let them wonder what happened to the men who rode out to murder a baby." "Is that what we did?" Morrison asked with quiet intensity. "Is that how history will remember us?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Everyone present had been complicit in the attempted infanticide, either as active participant or willing accomplice. The fact that they'd ultimately prevented the murder didn't erase their initial willingness to commit it. Reverend Gaines stirred from his unconscious state, coughing up water and groaning with pain from his shattered arm. When his eyes focused enough to recognize his surroundings, the first thing he saw was the baby sleeping peacefully in Mary Ellen's arms. "She's still alive," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yes," Tom said with cold finality. "She's still alive. No thanks to you." Gaines tried to sit up but fell back with a cry of pain. His arm was badly broken, possibly shattered beyond repair, and infection was already setting in around the bullet wound. Without proper medical care, he might not survive the next few days. "I'm sorry," Gaines said, though the words seemed inadequate for the magnitude of his crimes. "I'm so sorry for what I tried to do, for what I manipulated all of you into doing." "Sorry doesn't bring back Jake Henley," Morrison replied bluntly. "Sorry doesn't undo the fact that you had an entire community ready to commit infanticide to hide your adultery." "No." Gaines agreed, tears streaming down his face. "It doesn't. And I'll carry that guilt for whatever time I have left." He looked at Mary Ellen with eyes full of self-loathing. "I told myself I loved you. Told myself that what we were doing was about comfort and compassion. But it was all selfishness. I wanted you, and I was willing to destroy your family to have you." Mary Ellen flinched at the words, but didn't look away. "You told me Tom didn't understand me. You said he was too busy with the farm to care about my fears, my needs. You made me feel special, important." Her voice grew bitter. "You were very good at telling me what I wanted to hear. And when the baby came, when she looked like she might survive and grow up to reveal our secret, I panicked." Gaines continued his confession with the desperate honesty of a dying man. "I convinced myself that her death would be for the greater good, that saving my ministry was worth more than one innocent life." Tom listened to this exchange with the careful attention of someone trying to understand how his life had been turned upside down by other people's choices. When Gaines finished speaking, Tom was quiet for a long moment before responding. "How long?" he asked simply. "How long were you betting my wife?" Mary Ellen closed her eyes as if the answer was too painful to speak while looking at anyone. 6 months. It started when you were working those long days, trying to get the well dug before the drought got worse. I was alone with Clara, scared about the money running out, afraid we'd have to abandon the farm. And I was there." Gaines added with bitter self-awareness. "Available to listen to comfort, to make her feel like her fears mattered to someone. They mattered to me too," Tom said quietly, and there was more hurt than anger in his voice now. "But I was trying to solve them, not just sympathize with them. I thought providing for my family was more important than talking about problems we couldn't change. It was," Mary Ellen said, opening her eyes to meet her husband's gaze. "You were doing everything right, Tom. I was the one who was weak, who let fear and loneliness drive me into the arms of a man who told me pretty lies instead of hard truths. Clara, who'd been listening to this adult conversation with the wide-eyed attention of someone learning that the grown-up world was far more complicated than she'd imagined, finally spoke up. "Are you and Mama getting divorced?" she asked with the direct simplicity of childhood. "Is that why everyone's so sad?" Tom looked at his 6-year-old daughter, the child who'd shown more courage and moral clarity in one day than most adults managed in a lifetime, and felt something shift in his chest. Whatever anger and betrayal he felt toward Mary Ellen, Clara needed stability and security more than she needed her parents' marital conflicts played out in front of her. "I don't know, sweetheart," Tom said honestly. "Your mama and I have some things to work through. But no matter what happens between us, we both love you and your sister more than anything in the world." "Even though she's not really your baby?" Clara asked with a piercing insight that made adults uncomfortable. Tom looked at the infant sleeping in Mary Ellen's arms, the child born of another man's seed, the symbol of his public humiliation and the excuse that had nearly led to murder. She was tiny and helpless, completely dependent on the people around her for survival and protection. "She's innocent," Tom said finally. "Whatever mistakes the adults made, she's innocent of all of it. And innocent children deserve protection, not punishment." It was as close to forgiveness as he could manage, and perhaps as much as anyone had a right to expect after the day's revelations. But it was a start, an acknowledgement, that some things mattered more than pride or revenge. Sheriff Morrison had been listening to this family drama while wrestling with his own crisis of conscience. As the law in Dustwater, he had responsibilities that went beyond his personal feelings about right and wrong. "We can't go back," he said, suddenly surprising everyone with the finality in his voice. "Any of us. What we did today, what we almost did, it changes everything." "What do you mean?" Pete asked. "I mean that if we return to Dustwater and tell the truth, we'll all hang," Morrison replied bluntly. "Attempted murder of an infant, conspiracy, armed violence, the territorial authorities won't care about our reasons or regrets. They'll want justice, and justice will mean the gallows for everyone involved." "And if we lie?" Mary Ellen asked. "Then we become the kind of people who cover up attempted infanticide with more lies. We let a community believe their superstitions were justified, their actions acceptable. We enable the same kind of thinking that led to this morning's madness." Nahiosi had been listening to this conversation while tending the fire and watching over the sleeping children. Now he spoke with the quiet authority of someone who'd lived through similar moral crises. "There is third path," he said. "You do not return to Dustwater. You come north into mountains where my grandfather's people once lived, where children can grow up judged by their actions, not their blood or the sins of their parents." "You're talking about abandoning civilization entirely," Morrison protested. "No law, no schools, no medical care, no contact with the outside world." "What civilization?" Nahiosi asked, using the same argument he'd made earlier, but with greater force now that they'd all seen the results of their community's moral failure. "The kind that almost buried baby alive because of eclipse superstition. The kind where preacher manipulates people into murder to hide adultery. Where good people do terrible things because they are afraid." The question hung in the air like a challenge. What did they really owe to a society that had been willing to commit infanticide based on superstition and manipulation? It would be a hard life. Nahiosi continued. "No towns, no stores, no conveniences you are used to. You would have to learn Apache ways, Apache skills. Your children would grow up more Apache than white." "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Clara said with the surprising wisdom of someone who'd seen both cultures at their worst and best. "The Apache man saved us when our own people wanted to hurt my sister. Maybe Apache ways are better ways." Tom looked around the fire at the unlikely group that trauma had forged into something resembling a family. An exiled Apache warrior who'd chosen mercy over tribal loyalty. A sheriff who'd discovered that the law he served wasn't always just. A mother and father whose marriage had been shattered by betrayal, but who still shared love for their children. A preacher whose corruption had nearly led to mass murder, but who might yet find redemption through service. And two little girls who needed protection from a world that had proven itself capable of terrible cruelty toward the innocent. "What about you, Gaines?" Tom asked, looking at the injured preacher. "What happens to you in this new life we're contemplating?" Gaines looked at the baby in Mary Ellen's arms, the child he'd tried to have murdered to hide his sins. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he said quietly. "I don't deserve a chance to start over. But if you'll have me, I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to make amends. Helping with the children, doing whatever work I can with one good arm, proving that people can change if they truly want to. Children remember," Clara said with startling insight. "If you're mean to us now, we'll remember forever. But if you're nice to us, help take care of my sister, maybe we can forget the bad things you did." It was justice tempered by mercy, accountability, combined with the possibility of redemption. Gaines would have to live with his failures every day, but he wouldn't be abandoned to face them alone. As the fire burned down to glowing embers and the desert night settled around their temporary shelter, they made their plans. Tom would slip back to Dustwater before dawn, ostensibly to organize a search for flood victims, but really to gather what supplies and money he could for a permanent departure. Morrison would do the same, using his authority as sheriff to deflect suspicion while preparing for a journey that would take them beyond the reach of territorial law. Mary Ellen would focus on the children's needs, ensuring they had adequate supplies for infant care during the transition to wilderness life. Pete would help with the heavy work despite his injuries, and Gaines, despite his shattered arm and uncertain future, would contribute whatever strength he could to their collective survival. Nahiyasi would handle the most challenging task, leading a group of white refugees into Apache territory and convincing his estranged people to accept them as permanent residents. It wouldn't be easy, especially for a warrior who'd been exiled for choosing mercy over violence. But it was their only chance for a life free from the prejudices and superstitions that had nearly destroyed them all. "It won't be the life any of us planned," Tom said as Clara fell asleep against his uninjured side. "But maybe it's the life we need. A place where our children can grow up without carrying the burden of our mistakes." Outside their shelter, the desert night was alive, with the sounds of creatures going about their business. Night birds calling from hidden roosts, coyotes singing to the star-filled sky. Insects chirping their ancient songs of survival and reproduction. It was the sound of a world that continued regardless of human conflicts, a reminder that there were ways of living that didn't depend on the approval or understanding of civilized society. In the morning, they would begin the journey toward that different way of life, leaving behind the world of small-town prejudices and moral compromises that had nearly led to the murder of an innocent child. For Clara and her sister, it would mean growing up in a place where their worth was measured by their character and actions, rather than the circumstances of their birth or the sins of their parents. They would learn to hunt and track, to read weather signs, and find water in seemingly barren landscapes, to speak two languages and understand two cultures without being fully accepted by either. They would be raised by people who'd chosen conscience over convenience, protection over prejudice, and mercy over revenge. They would learn that when the world turned dark and cruel, there were always those willing to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. And perhaps most importantly, they would grow up knowing that redemption was possible for anyone willing to face their failures and work to become better than they'd been before. It wasn't the ending anyone had planned, but it was an ending that honored both justice and compassion, the twin pillars on which any decent society must be built. As sleep finally claimed the exhausted survivors, the baby stirred in Mary Ellen's arms and made the soft sounds that meant she was dreaming. Whatever those dreams contained, they were the dreams of someone who'd been saved from death by the choices of people who decided that some things, innocence, mercy, the protection of the helpless, were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. And in a world where such choices were often rare and precious, that was perhaps the most hopeful thing of all. 2 months later, the letter arrived in Dustwater with a freight wagon carrying supplies from Santa Fe, tucked among other correspondence for the territorial settlements. Deputy Jim Crawford, who'd been running the sheriff's office since Morrison's disappearance, read it first by lamplight in the empty jail, where dust motes danced like spirits of the missing. Crawford: "By now the search parties will have given up looking for survivors from the flash flood that swept through Willow Creek Canyon. Let them believe we were all claimed by the waters. It's kinder than the truth, and perhaps necessary for a community that needs to heal from its own capacity for evil. We are alive and well, all of us, in a place where the air runs thin and clean, and children learn that a person's worth has nothing to do with the circumstances of their birth. Clara has become an accomplished tracker who can read animal sign better than most grown men, and start a fire in howling wind using nothing but flint steel and dry grass. She speaks Apache now with increasing fluency, though she still prefers English when she's frightened or homesick. The baby, we call her Ayana now, which means eternal blossom in the Apache tongue, grows stronger each day in the high mountain air. Her first clear word was Ada, which she uses for Nahiosi, the warrior who saved her from a grave, meant for the living, and now raises her as his own blood. She will never know how close she came to being murdered in her first week of life, or understand the adult failures that nearly destroyed her before she could take her first steps. Tom and Mary Ellen work side by side now in the ancient Apache way, their marriage slowly mending from wounds that ran deeper than any bullet. Forgiveness is a gradual process that may take years to complete. But they've learned that love isn't just about passion and romance. It's about choosing to build something together, despite the mistakes that could tear it apart. Tom has proven surprisingly skilled at hunting elk and mountain sheep, while Mary Ellen tends a small garden that supplements our diet of game and gathered plants with vegetables that grow remarkably well in the thin soil and bright sunlight of the high country. Morrison has found his true calling among the Apache elders, his natural sense of justice and authority, earning respect among people who have little reason to trust white lawmen. He serves as a bridge between cultures, helping resolve disputes and ensuring that everyone, Apache and white alike, follows the community's laws. His badge means nothing here, but his character means everything. And he's discovered that real law enforcement has more to do with protecting the innocent than punishing the guilty. Even Gaines has found a place among us, though his path to redemption remains long and difficult. His shattered arm healed poorly and will never be strong again. But he's learned to help with the children using patience and gentleness that surprises everyone who knew him in his previous life. The man who once manipulated a community into attempted infanticide now spends his days ensuring that Apache orphans are fed, clothed, and taught the skills they need to survive. There's something fitting in that transformation, perhaps, even something that approaches justice. Tell the people of Dustwater that their drought ended not because a cursed child was removed from their midst, but because weather follows natural patterns that have nothing to do with human superstitions or divine anger. Tell them that prosperity comes to communities that treat their members with decency and protect their most vulnerable, not to those who look for scapegoats when times get hard. Most importantly, tell them that Clara Ricketts and her baby sister are thriving in a place where they're valued for who they are, rather than judged for circumstances beyond their control. They're growing up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable with Apache hunting chants and English lullabies, learning that strength comes from understanding different ways of seeing the world, rather than insisting there's only one right way to live. Clara's latest accomplishment is bringing down a young deer with her bow from 60 yards a shot that would challenge experienced hunters. Ayana took her first unsteady steps last week, tottering between Mary Ellen's arms and Nahiosi's outstretched hands, while the Apache children cheered her progress. She's learning that she belongs to everyone in the community, and everyone belongs to her, which is perhaps the most important lesson any child can absorb. We won't be returning to Dustwater, and we ask that no one comes searching for us. We're beyond the reach of territorial law now in hidden valleys, where only Apache feet know the trails and only Apache eyes can read the signs that lead to safety. But know that we're protected and prosperous, that justice of a sort has been served, and that 2 little girls who nearly died for adult sins are growing up free from the fears and prejudices that nearly destroyed them. The enclosed gold dust should more than cover Tom's outstanding debts and provide a small fund for families in genuine need. Consider it payment for a community's willingness to let the dead rest buried and the missing remain lost. Use it wisely for the benefit of those who have no other advocates or protectors. Give our regards to those who showed kindness during our time in Dustwater, and our forgiveness to those who were led astray by desperation and false teaching. Everyone deserves the chance to learn from their mistakes and choose a better path forward. In closing, remember, these children are never responsible for the failures of adults, and no child deserves to suffer for circumstances beyond their control. Hold that truth sacred, and perhaps tragedies like the one we narrowly avoided will never again stain your community with innocent blood. The mountains are calling, and we must go. But we go in peace, carrying hope that people can change, that communities can learn wisdom from their failures, and that mercy and justice can coexist in the hearts of those who choose courage over fear. Friends who found a better path. Crawford folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk beside the official report listing 7 citizens as missing, presumed dead in flash flood. It was a comfortable fiction that allowed everyone in Dustwater to avoid confronting too closely what had really happened during those desperate days when drought and eclipse superstition had nearly led to infanticide. The town had prospered remarkably since the rains returned. Crops grew tall and green cattle fattened on restored grassland, and the creek ran full and clear for the first time in almost a year. A new preacher had arrived from Colorado, a young man named Father McKenna, who spoke about community service and caring for the vulnerable, rather than divine retribution and blood sacrifice. Church attendance had actually increased, as if people were hungry for spiritual leadership that emphasized love over fear. But Crawford knew, as did the few others who'd been present during those final days before the disappearances, that prosperity built on willful ignorance was fragile at best. The capacity for mob violence and scapegoating hadn't vanished with the return of good weather. It merely waited for the next crisis and the next moment when fear might overcome decency and communities might again look for innocents to blame for problems beyond anyone's control. The only defense was memory. Remembering what they'd almost done. Remembering how close they'd come to murdering a baby because it seemed easier than accepting their own powerlessness against natural forces. Remembering that good people could do terrible things when they were frightened enough and given permission by authority figures they trusted. As Crawford prepared to lock up the sheriff's office for the evening, he walked to the window and looked out at Dustwater's main street. Children played in dust that had been mud during the drought, months their laughter carrying clearly in the evening air. Families headed toward home, and supper their faces relaxed in ways that spoke of security and contentment. Merchants closed their shops after successful days of trading with farmers whose harvest had exceeded all expectations. It was a picture of frontier prosperity and community cooperation, the kind of place where neighbors helped each other through hard times and everyone worked together for the common good. The kind of settlement where something like attempted infanticide seemed impossible, unthinkable, completely contrary to everything they believed about themselves as decent Christian people. But Crawford had been there. He'd seen the shallow grave and heard the baby's terrified cries. He'd watched ordinary citizens convince themselves that murder was not only acceptable, but necessary when they were desperate enough and scared enough and given religious justification by someone they trusted to guide their moral decisions. It could happen again. Different circumstances, different scapegoats, but the same underlying willingness to sacrifice the helpless when survival seemed to require it. The same tendency to look for simple solutions to complex problems, even when those solutions required the community to become monstrous. Walking home through streets where oil lamps flickered in windows and families gathered for evening meals, Crawford thought about the letter's final message. Somewhere in the high mountains beyond the reach of territorial authority and community pressure, two little girls were learning a different way of life from people who'd chosen mercy over convention and protection over prejudice. Clara would grow up skilled in arts that most white children never learned, tracking game through wilderness that would challenge experienced frontiersmen, reading weather signs that could mean the difference between life and death, speaking a language that connected her to people who measured worth by character rather than bloodline. Ayanna would take her first steps in a world where being born under an eclipse made her special rather than cursed, where the circumstances of her conception mattered far less than the love of the people raising her. They would be raised by an Apache warrior who'd risked everything to save a stranger's child, by parents who'd learned that marriage was about more than avoiding loneliness, by a former sheriff who discovered that real justice had little to do with badges and everything to do with protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Even by a disgraced preacher who'd found redemption through service to the children he'd once tried to destroy. It wasn't a perfect solution. Human beings were incapable of perfection. But it was perhaps the best possible outcome, given the failures and fears that had brought them all to that desperate moment in the desert. They'd found a way to transform tragedy into hope, to build something meaningful from the wreckage of their old lives. The stars were emerging now, the same stars that shone down on hidden Apache camps, where children grew up bilingual and bicultural, belonging fully to neither world, but finding strength in understanding both. Where a baby who'd nearly been buried alive for the sin of being born was learning to walk and laugh and explore with the fearless curiosity of the very young. Where justice tempered by mercy had created space for people to become better than they'd been. Crawford reached his modest house and paused on the porch to look back toward the mountains that rose like purple shadows against the star-filled sky. Somewhere up there, beyond territorial law and community judgment, people who'd nearly lost their humanity had found a way to reclaim it through acts of courage and compassion. It wasn't the ending anyone had planned when they'd ridden out that morning to bury a baby alive, but it was an ending that honored the possibility of redemption, the power of choice, and the truth that children deserve protection from the failures of the adults who brought them into the world. And in a frontier where such endings were rare and precious, that was perhaps the most hopeful thing Crawford could imagine. He went inside to his own quiet supper, carrying with him the knowledge that somewhere in the vast wilderness, love had triumphed over fear, mercy had overcome vengeance, and two little girls were growing up safe in the arms of people who'd chosen to be better than their worst impulses. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.